So welcome. This is a key event because it highlights the learning we value most. Students doing real research in real settings on questions that matter. And it really fits into the broader vision that we've had for our undergraduate research pathways that our undergraduate curricular committee and the research committee have been working on, making research, particularly undergraduate research, more visible, more supported, more accessible. I want to recognize our presenters here, and which I'll name here in a moment. But just, an undergraduate thesis is not an insignificant undertaking. And so just want to remark on that. And then finally, I have to use this moment as a pitch to remind folks that we now have some certificates, technically they're micro-credentials, on skills and one on undergraduate research. And if you want to know more about those, come talk to me or someone on the undergraduate committee. So each student is going to have 10 to 12 minutes, although we have two students presenting together, so they'll have 20 to 24 minutes to present, and then 3 to 5 minutes for questions. We're also, at the end, if we have time, going to open it up more broadly across students for questions. But we have Morgan Persuit, who's going to be going first, Jiwon Son and Ben Jordan going second, Ejuan Kendrick going third, and then fourth, Cordelia Van der Veer. And so I'm just going to turn it right over to Morgan to get us started. Thanks, everyone, for being here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Morgan Persuit. To introduce myself, I am a public policy analysis and economics major. This semester, or the past semester as well, I focused my research on classifying state-level predictive AI models for overdose prevention and performed a comparative policy analysis. And through Dr. Hooker's help, I have created and written this thesis, still underway, but I'm excited to share my findings with you all. So to go into a little bit of the disciplines that my thesis draws upon, it explores the intersection between public health, data science, and policy. I looked at a nationwide scan of where the nation is at this time in terms of predictive capacity, and I'll go into what that means. And then I perform a case study of 4 specific states that have well-documented machine learning-based AI models. To start with the motivation, for context, the overdose epidemic has been a pressing issue since the mid-1990s, but just in 2023 alone, there were 105,000 plus overdose deaths. It's important to recognize, however, this isn't the only problem. Non-fatal overdoses occur much more frequently, and they actually provide real-time signals of risk. It's not a direct relationship, but part of the reason why states have been able to deploy these models is because of these real-time signals, non-fatal overdoses. So we've seen an increase in states adopting machine learning-based predictive analytics or predictive AI models. However, these systems vary widely in their design, transparency, and governance. Design meaning maybe what kind of machine learning method they use, how well documented it is, transparency, whether they reveal or how clearly they reveal the data sources they use, how they validated a model, meaning how accurate it made predictions, and then governance refers to privacy protections and accountability, because a lot of this data deals with private information. A lot of it may come from the prescription drug monitoring program, which may have sensitive information about individuals, so that's what governance refers to. First, I will give a brief overview of how these 3 terms fit together. So artificial intelligence is a broad term referring to systems that can simulate human thinking, reasoning, sometimes even decision-making. And then machine learning is a subset of artificial intelligence. That's systems that can learn from patterns in data and most of the time vast amounts of data without being explicitly programmed. And then predictive analytics, although this figure can be a bit misleading because predictive analytics is a broader field, it can refer to using common and really historically used statistical techniques. It can also refer to the use of machine learning to forecast an outcome in the future. Next, I'll go into the gaps. So what this thesis adds. We don't know how the current systems compare. There are very few. Most of them are single case or technical. I'll go and show you guys a nationwide map of what states have deployed these models, what states have actually adopted a dashboard for use, and what states have emerging capacity for utilizing these models. So what's missing is a cross-state comparison, an analysis of how each state is dealing with sensitive data, managing it, and then also how it's being implemented and used. And I'll go into a little bit more soon, but basically, because this is a public health issue, a variety of stakeholders are going to be using these dashboards and models. There's not a causal relationship between them using the model and perhaps allocating resources. However, it provides them with insights into what risk there might be in the future for a certain geographic level within their state. And the bottom line is there's a need for a structured classification framework. So this study creates a comparative framework. Not first, but throughout this research process, I classified all 50 states and the District of Columbia. I'll go into the system that I use to do so. I also developed 5 domain classifications, and then within those classifications, created indicators to look at these different reports and the case studies I use and indicate if they were reported, if this information was reported, if it was partially reported or described, or if it was not reported. And the bottom line is this moves from a description, there's documentation out there, like I said, but to a systematic comparison, putting all this information together and then seeing how these states differ. Next, I'll go into my framework. So the 5 domains I created are very broad. Surveillance and data quality is going to refer to data sources, completeness, representativeness. That essentially means how reliable is the underlying data in the model. Completeness is going to refer to are there gaps in data? For example, if one state is using hospital data, are all the data that it's used, did it capture all of those hospitals? And then representativeness will refer to how much the data actually will represent the population it's trying to predict. Predictive model performance, this is going to include validation methods, accuracy metrics, and how well the model is reported. So I think I said this earlier, but validation is going to refer to determining the accuracy of the predictions that the model makes. And this can occur in a variety of ways. It's important not to silo it, but this has to do with identifying accuracy metrics and making sure that the model predicts what that accuracy metric is defined as. Next is usability and actionability. This refers to whether the system's built to actually support decision-making. Like I said, only a few states have deployed predictive dashboards or even researched it. However, I meant models because only a couple of them have actually deployed dashboards for use. And then equity, ethics, and governance. This refers to, like I said earlier, bias mitigation, transparency, privacy, and human oversight. Human oversight can refer to having a human in the loop, having a human review the outputs of the model to determine if maybe the output looks wrong, and if it's appropriate for a human to step in and make judgment rather than relying on the model. And then stability and sustainability refers to whether data can continuously be ingested into the model. It's important that the underlying infrastructure and data that's feeding the model is consistent, that the model is also documented since these models are changing very frequently. And so yes, this study will cover both technical performance and real world use. So this is a national snapshot. I'll go into the tiers. My first tier is tier 0. That essentially means those states are relying on just static reports. And that's in the gray. So tier 1 refers to descriptive states, meaning they have deployed a dashboard, but it's using past data and it's not predicting an outcome. I identified a lot of variation within these states. Tier 1A is using fatal data only, and I emphasize the importance of non-fatal data being real-time signal. Tier 1B, and that teal color is fatal and non-fatal data. There was one interesting case study, South Carolina, which employed biosurveillance. And then some of them are prevention-focused, meaning their dashboards show where different resources and recovery infrastructure was within the state. Tier 2 means that there's evidence of descriptive and analytics modeling capacity. Maybe a state released a study about it, but it's not being implemented and used by the actual state. It, in a lot of cases, was just a university study. And then Tier 3 is an operational predictive system, meaning that it's deployed. Ohio and Rhode Island are publicly available. Florida is not, but those that indicator means that the model is actually deployed. This is just a little bit of context around the tier system. Tier 0, like I said, static reports, descriptive dashboards. Many of them appear this way. Many of them have very similar geographic granularity, like county level. Emerging predictive capacity had to do with looking into those studies, those university studies. And then this is an example of Ohio's operational predictive system. So this is a quick case study comparison. Ohio and Rhode Island, like I said, are deployed. Tennessee and Pennsylvania had very detailed documentation about their model. So I was able to kind of compare and apply these indicators to them. Ohio is real-time and operational. However, it has limited model transparency. Contrast that with Rhode Island. It has very strong validation techniques described, but no clear privacy protections. Ohio, although not completely clear, made a clear indicator, made a kind of vague indicator in their documentation about protecting personally identifiable information. Tennessee, a strength is that they engage stakeholders. It's between, this dashboard was developed between the Tennessee Health Department and Vanderbilt University. However, the limitation is there's no explicit bias safeguards. Pennsylvania employs very transparent methods, but their data is based on Medicaid data, so it's not applicable to the whole population, so it's not representative, and the data also, there's lots of missing data pieces as noted in their documentation. So the main theme is that no state fully reflects all domains in the framework. These are key findings. Kind of what I said in the case study, upfront methodological validation versus ongoing system maintenance. Ohio doesn't really disclose their model validation, but it reports version control. It reports whenever it changes the data and how the model changed. Rhode Island reports a detailed model development, but it doesn't document continuous changes. I've noticed a trade-off between usability and technical rigor. The operational systems like Ohio are not always well documented. Most research models, while they're documented very clearly in their methods, they're not used in practice. And an overall theme across all states was that governance was largely unreported. So bias, privacy, and accountability were undisclosed or referenced vaguely, and it was often implied in these studies, but this is critical to be transparent about due to the reliance on sensitive data. So the big insight, states can build predictive systems. There's lots of infrastructure, lots of technology, but there's no shared standards, there's no consistent reporting, and there's limited coordination. So the fragmentation across these states is driving variation within their systems. Conclusion, coordination is a missing piece. States can share best practices, align evaluation standards, and improve transparency and governance. Better coordination can lead to stronger public health. And
first, I want to celebrate this work. I learned a lot from you. The first question I have was, what time period does your nationwide scan consider? So like how far back do you consider a predictive model?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think I started this about a couple months ago. So the current descriptive systems, I researched and they're operational. Like the dashboard's operational, I kind of looked at that. The predictive models, I think Ohio's was released about a year ago, Rhode Island's as well. These seem to follow the same timeline. But as far as the university studies, some are actually kind of older. So it would just depend on whether it was documented. I actually did reach out to some states, such as West Virginia. Their state did have a dashboard made by a private contractor, but they didn't deploy it, and it's been around for a while. So it varies across time periods. It just depends on, and this is part of the limitation of the study, is that I can't know everything. Everything's not out there. But I was able to kind of gauge when, I would say it's been in the last few years, but the predictive models definitely came out about like a year or two ago.
Thank you.
Yes.
Why do you think some states are able to have the predictive models? Is it related to like data availability or capacity of the government? Or?
Yeah, that's a good question. I definitely think it could have to do with the capacity of the government. In my own experience, I work at the Department of Administrative Services in their Office of Data and Efficiency, and certain states, and I know this from the fact that I've heard sometimes states will collaborate and they'll share like, this is what I have, this is what I have. It can have to do with the tools you have, what's contracted, the state capacity you have in terms of your employees, whether they're able to perform this kind of work. Contracting is very expensive, so I know at the state this was all done in-house. I did an interview with the Director of Recovery Ohio who kind of led this effort. So it really does depend on maybe funding, the employees, the capacity they have, and then maybe even if they're aware.
One last question. Thank you so much. All right. So our next two presenters, come on up. You're going to get them set, Sophia? Okay.
All right, better. So,
I took some notes.
Thank you so much.
Oh, no, here. Great, okay.
Good afternoon. My name is Ben. I'm a second-year international studies student.
I'm Jiwon Son. I'm a third-year major in economics.
Yeah, we're going to present today on our work on job postings and testing this past semester. We sort of have three purposes to our research here. Number one is to acknowledge the lag between the job postings and the profile of these occupations. What's actually in the job postings, what we think this could be. How can we support state and local government investments, and how do we guide performance improvement? Here's our research team up at Ohio Research Center. Mark's a data scientist who's been doing a lot of work with us. Josh, the director. So I'll just start with a task is an assignment that needs to be completed in a job. So that's what a task is, like administer medication to a patient. And analyzing tasks like this has been used for a long time for various purposes. You can go back all the way to Taylor, who defined manufacturing tasks and Henry Ford's manufacturing process, and that was to guide productivity gains. The Training Within Industries Act of World War II focused on training individuals to perform certain tasks for the war effort. And coming to this century, Autor, Levy, and Renee, these are economists that have been using tasks to analyze change in work. And how they did that is they looked at the DOT, that's the Dictionary of Occupational Titles. They looked at different tasks across decades to see how work has been changing in different occupations. Today, ONET is the database that contains task statements officially from the government. It's the successor of the DOT. And analyzing these kinds of data, they rely on the updates of the databases themselves, and so we also look at how we can look at job postings, which will be updated frequently by human resources professionals, and managers.
Next, we will look at the sources of data with such as ONET and talent neuron, which we are actually using for the tech analysis. First, governmental occupational database started with the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, or DOT. It was last updated in 1991, and it included some occupational information like job titles, task statements, or training requirements. Though it has some inherent weaknesses, such as recording childcare workers as having no skill due to a common bias that female-dominated fields often require less to no skill compared to male-dominated fields. And then that database transitioned to ONET, which is the current data source from the Department of Labor. Now that includes titles, task elements, skills, educational requirements, or some other occupational information. And it's refreshed at least annually. They often release about 4 databases every year with about 3 to 4 months term. Now, data are derived from about 923 jobs. They come from various surveys, web scraping, and expert judgment. And since 2022, they have been implementing AI in the data collection for their emerging tasks. And Talent Neuron is a global labor market intelligence platform that we use to gather job posting data. They aggregate job posting data from about 40,000 sources, including company job boards, trade publications, government reports, and they process approximately 1.3 million job postings daily within US only. They also provide their data as a CSV file, including position ID, CSV fixed code, original title, standard title, and job description. Their method includes extracting the data through NLP and aligning the data with the SOC system. That includes like transitioning a company original title like software guru to a standard title like software engineer. And although they go through their own deduplication process, there are still some overlapping job posting data that we should go through a deduplication process of ourselves in order to use it. And now we will look at specifically the emerging tasks that the ONET database provides. So emerging tasks are new or revised tasks that is not included in the current formal task statements data that is provided by job incumbents or occupational experts. Unlike formal tasks, they aren't provided with a task ID. And before they are actually implemented into the official task list, they must be approved by an expert or an incumbent that they're actually relevant. And the retention threshold for deciding whether a task statement is relevant enough or not was increased from 10% to 25% since version 29.0, which was released in August 2024. One problem we found while looking through these emerging tasks was that they often took about 9 years until they were actually implemented into a formal list. So originally, they used a process where they would first gather manual reviews from job incumbents and experts and see whether there are like 5 overlapping write-in statements about the same task. Then they would implement it, draft it, and finalize it into the list. Now they have redesigned the process so that they first use the expert model for initial screening. And if there is even 2 overlapping write-in statements, they draft it and finalize it into the list. So this use of NLP in the initial screening actually gave a 68.9% reduction in staff hours and successfully produced 42 new or revised task statements across 80 occupations. So here is a visualization of that change. we see that after since version 28.3, there are a lot more added tasks to the list with the revised approach. And less tasks are being removed for the emerging task list and added to a formal task statement list with the increased retention threshold since version 29.0. Another change is about what kind of jobs were appearing more in the new as a new added task statement. So before revision, the top 5 were life, physical, and social science occupations, educational instruction and library occupations, healthcare practitioners and production occupations, architecture and engineering occupations. And we didn't see much change even after the revision because 3 of the top 5 occupations, life, physical, and social science, architecture and engineering, healthcare practitioners, and technical occupations are the same. And the only 2 that appeared new is the protection services and installation, maintenance, and repair services, repair occupations, which aren't that technology sensitive or having fast trend as we expected. Because initially going into this analysis, we expected more occupations such as computer and math or office and admin, which are way more technology sensitive and incorporate kind of more new technology trends into their occupation to be on top on the list. Because reports from sources such as Anthropic indicated that certain occupational sectors, including computer and mathematical occupations or office and administrative occupations, are seeing a high AI exposure score in how much of their tasks are actually kind of automated or covered by AI. But as the graph shows, that wasn't really the case that ONET is showing through their newly implemented task statements. Rather, occupations such as computer or mathematical or office and admin didn't receive any new task statements since version 28.3. So some problems we are seeing here is that ONET has a very stagnant data. They don't remove any outdated emerging tasks, and many tasks in the current database are from 2010s, the oldest being in the current version coming from 2007. There is a retention lag that it takes many years before an emerging task to be actually moved to task statements. And while Anthropic claims high AI exposure score from certain occupational categories, ONET task statements and emerging tasks are not really representing this change in their database.
So we've seen how the emerging tasks look through the lens of ONET. So maybe how can we look at job postings to see if the change in work? And how we do that is we can look and say, hey, job postings have task statements. We can compare those with the task statements in ONET. And Talent Neuron allows us to look at the 6-digit SOC level. So that's the lowest SOC level that the Department of Bureau of Labor Statistics actually gives. ONET has an 8-digit SSA, but we can't use that. There's not that many. Those are just certain specific occupations. But yeah, so we can look at these job postings and ask which ONET tasks are in the job postings and which are not. And maybe we can also ask which tasks are not in ONET that are in the job postings. That's an important one that we'll come back to a little bit later. So we chose 120 occupations over 4 years based on the supply and demand gap in Ohio. So these occupations have a higher supply and demand gap. And the data we'll be seeing here is mostly on registered nurses. So I'm going to walk through the comparison pipeline that we do. Over here on the left is a culinary shift lead posting, or an abbreviated posting. It has some HR language and some task statements there. And over here is the ONET SOC 6 code, 3 task statements from that database that it would match to. There's about 20 for each occupation, but here's just 3 of them that'll match later. So the step 1 is to extract the sentences, and how we do that is we use a pre-trained machine learning model called PUNCT that separates sentences based on periods, but it doesn't separate sentences based on periods that aren't between sentences like an abbreviation. What it doesn't do is separate sentences that are not periods. And you can see in our job posting, semicolon, hyphen, those are 2 objects that are actually quite common in job postings that separate task statements. And we learned that if we replace those with periods, we get better data for the task statements. And then, so we have 5 sentences, great. These bottom 2 are not task statements. We don't really want those, so we have a filter. We filter out, for example, sentences that include equal opportunity employer. There's a lot of sentences like that in job postings, and these kinds of physical requirements, pathogen exposures, things like that get filtered out. And also we have the sentences have to be between 5 and 25 words in length, because we can assume that sentences outside that length will not be task statements. The second step will be to embed these sentences. And so we use a Google BERT model, all mini LM L6 B2. We send these sentences through 6 transformer layers, and it creates these sentences into 384-dimensional vectors. So we're turning these sentences into math. And what that allows us to do is take these job posting sentences as vectors and compare them to the ONET tasks as vectors. And we use cosine similarity, and that will find the angle between 2 vectors in 3 dimensions. We can think about a vector going this way, vector going this way. Those are different. The similarity score will be low, and then it'll be closer. It'll be high. And so that's how we find if these sentences are similar. The third step is to apply a GMM threshold. We can assume that these raw similarity scores will be bimodal. There's going to be non-task statements over here on the left and task statements on the right that have a higher score matched to these task statements from ONET. So we use the Gaussian mixture model to find the 2 distributions, and we set a threshold in between them. Here's what it looks like with our culinary shift lead sentences. All these matches are actually quite good. They all make it through the threshold. No non-task made it through the filter. And in fact, if you look at the full job posting, everything that went through the threshold and the filter were task statements, which is good. And you can say, all right, well, we have an instance of this task statement now in the job posting. So we count those and see the frequency of tasks. Look at what that looks like. Registered nurse postings. Bring in Jiwon's emerging tasks. For the 17 quarters that we have for registered nurses, nursing postings, about 33 to 37% of the sentences were emerging tasks, and 80% of postings contained them. And it was stable across all 17 quarters, which is interesting. So we're not seeing much change in the use of the emerging tasks in registered nurses, at least. And there are the top 2. How many sentences were matched to the top ONET tasks, emerging tasks. I'm not going to say much about the meaning behind this, but you can say, look, these are the tasks that are in the job postings, and these are the ones that are not really. There are some limitations with this. So we've also noticed that the threshold lets in high match non-tasks, and in some postings, majority of the taken sentences are not tasks at all, and some tasks are left out. And it's important to ask, are these tasks that are left out new tasks that are not known yet? And I have a futuristic culinary shift lead task here, optimize AI-driven inventory and smart sourcing. It will give a score of 0.4316, which is below the 0.4747 threshold, so it's not considered in this case. And so maybe we need to look elsewhere and how to analyze these tasks that aren't known yet. And here's some more examples of tasks that aren't known, that didn't get past the threshold. In human resources managers, maybe these tasks can represent more interactive work, and data entry keys, maybe more analytical work. These are just things that I noticed reading them. We'll talk about why I had to do that. So if we can go back to Autor, see that. So this is going back all the way to 1960 to 2000, and he was analyzing how tasks have changed due to automation through computers. And he noticed that non-routine analytic and non-routine interactive tasks were the ones that are coming up as things get automated. And you were seeing that in those task statements that I showed you just a minute ago. But there's some difficulties with this. They're hard to identify. All those task statements I went out and picked out myself. And that's because the sentences below the GMM threshold, they're almost entirely HR boilerplate language. This is a confusing graph, but what is it? It's showing is the count of sentences that have a certain similarity score within a bucket of 0.0005. So there's not that many scores that these points should have, but we still see these huge spikes in the data. What these are identical sentences. Like this spike here, there's about 15,000 instances of the sentence, strong organizational skills required. So analyzing this data, it's hard to find these tasks automatically and to analyze these jobs. So going forward, you can use a task classifier by training on pre-classified data to identify these tasks without having to use a filter, things like that, and matching them. We can use cluster analysis on that potentially, and going back to the match tasks, instead of looking at new tasks, we can see all the tasks that are actually being automated. I'll take any questions.
So I was curious if you could go back to slide 12. I first want to celebrate you. This is a lot of work that you're presenting, which is, I learned a lot from you. I would love to understand that horizontal axis.
Oh, yeah, this is a graph where I just put in all the version that's available in the current implement database release.
Okay.
And saw how many times a certain version occurred among each comment. Oh, sorry. So, at first, I determined like how many task statements were added or removed going from one version to another. And then I put that list of what version had this task added and what version had this task removed to this graph where it showed just like how many task statements were newly added to each occupational categories.
Yes. That's very helpful.
Yeah,
Thank
so this means that 5 new task statements were added to SSC group 37.
Okay. Yes, thank you.
We often think about research as being a solitary endeavor, but you've been working on a team. And so I'd love to hear just a little bit about your team process. Like I understand that for like qualitative research, like we would do like analyst triangulation, things like that. So I'm just curious, like, to hear a little bit about your team process.
We sort of came here this January, and there was already work started by Zach and working with Mark as well. And so we built off of what Zach did as an undergraduate student. And we sort of work separately on different tasks. And, but I work mostly, Jiwon worked on this mostly alone, pretty much, with the help of some others. But Mark has been working hard on the comparison pipeline, and I've helped him with that. That's sort of our pipeline kind of branch out a little bit, come together. Can
I ask another one? This is a bit of a meta question, but you present multiple data sources, right? So the original DOT, now ONET, now this other alternative from Talent Neuron. Is there do you have an opinion on why it's important to have multiple sources to compare? Or is it important to have multiple sources for this data?
That's why I was saying at the end, maybe we should classify these job postings themselves. But a lot of what we were doing was looking at what was different between the job postings and the profile of the occupations, which is the ONET database.
Yeah.
So
It's okay if you, yeah. I think it's sort of, I don't know, so, yeah.
right. Good question.
Thank you so much. Yep. All right.
Notes that I learned from you and then questions I had, and then I had a few little edits that I found. I may have missed.
I like how you're representing Japan.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ejuan Kendrick. I'll be discussing my thesis, policing pendulum between road change between drug enforcement and harm reduction. Just to give a personal background, and I will get into the study. So I'm a fourth year here in Glenn. We'll be graduating in a few weeks, and a whole host of other things up there. But most importantly, I've been working as a research assistant on the Good Samaritan Law my entirety of my undergraduate career under Dr. Perdue, who's been my advisor and mentor throughout the research process, along with Dr. Hassan. I've been working as a research assistant, conducting lit reviews, coding, and a whole host of other things as a research assistant, which also inspired my thesis. The question that we'll be talking about as we move forward. So I'll lay the foundation a little bit as we move forward into getting into my thesis. So first, I would just like to talk about the opioid epidemic, which is the basis of the Good Samaritan Law study, which also inspired my thesis that I conducted. And so we see here that the opioid epidemic created a major public health crisis, and we've seen through this host of research, especially in the midst of COVID, where the data set and then the pool of applicants are post pandemic, which was one of the heights of the opioid epidemic. We also see Ohio experience a severe and substantial overdose epidemic as well. Ohio is on average in the top 15 states with the highest opioid-related mortality-related deaths. And so with that, we also see high mortality leads to Ohio harm reduction policies such as the Good Samaritan Law, which was the grounding of my thesis in the study I've been working on for the last 4 years. Still laying the foundation, we see law enforcement as first responders. So police officers are often among first responders in the midst of the opioid crisis, especially they're usually first on scene when responding to overdoses. So we see that here. And so many agencies now allow officers to carry Narcan and things like that in the midst of them being first responders to opioid-related incidents. And still laying the foundation. Historically, police emphasize enforcement type policies, think war on drugs type, but we see U.S. drug policy shifting from punitive to more harm reduction. And so police police departments are also shifting with the enforcement-based approach to harm reduction approach, considering naloxone being carried by most officers. Also with treatment referrals been in the midst of police officers' toolkits, along with referral and things of that nature. So the purpose of this study was to examine police officers' perspectives in the midst of the opioid epidemic in terms of their new roles in shifting again from enforcement to a harm reduction approach, especially as the responsibilities are increasing social service and health-related incidents, which typically isn't their role. So again, the methods of this study, it draws from the larger study I've been working on, is the Good Samaritan Law study. We looked at, we used qualitative interviews to conduct this study. So we looked at 2 urban epicenters, 1 larger epicenter and 1 mid-size. We redacted for privacy reasons the names of the cities where the participants are from, the departments they're from. We have 26 law enforcement officers from the mid-sized metropolitan area, and we have 21 from the larger metropolitan area. So officers for this study were recruited during the roll call. Officers typically participate in hour-long interviews. So the data analysis approach to this study, interviews were digitally recorded and transcribed in this Hackett software. The coding followed a hybrid deductive-inductive approach with terms of like coding. Again, the initial study was the Good Samaritan Law study, so the initial codes were for the Good Samaritan Law. They had to be revised, and as we looked through the data from the Good Samaritan Law study, that's where my thesis arose from the questions that we would like answers for. So the data was analyzed, and we used a thematical analysis to identify other patterns in the participants from the study. And so we have here the demographic survey results from the people that participated. We had officers mostly range from 26 to 55. 80% of the participants were male, and majority of the participants were also non-white Hispanic males, mostly with bachelor's degrees. And so during the interview, Dr. Perdue and other researchers when asking the participants, so participants within the study, 75% knew someone with a substance use disorder, and over half of them knew someone who actually overdosed personally. So we've seen that in the data we collected. And the results. So for the sake of time, we'll focus on theme 1, personal history and motivation for joining law enforcement, because we see 3 sub-themes within the results that we have here. So for in terms of motivation, we see service, public service motivation. We see personal or familial trauma with substance use as a motivation for law enforcement. We also see enforcement-oriented motivation. Typically, those participants had military backgrounds, more staunch view, rigid view in the terms. And so theme 1, personal history and motivation for joining law enforcement, public service, sub-theme 1, public service oriented. Officers in the interviews, many of them showed early desire to help, and that consistently emerged among the participants. And we've seen that as like, when we asked, like, what are your motivations for joining law enforcement? Many of the participants, I like to help people. We also see the desire to still remain present throughout their careers by the analysis that we conducted about from the officers. So I pulled a few quotes here so one here, just not to read it fully. This officer described, it's cool to help people, and that's generally the motivation this officer described. But we also see here in this second quote, the officer with a background in vice described his interaction with people with substance use disorders and his desire to, instead of like an enforcement approach of arresting them, asking them if they had the tools to deal with the midst of if an overdose incident happened. And moving forward to sub-theme 2, personal or familial trauma with substance use as a motivator. So many officers described a strong motivator for law enforcement through that familial trauma and substance use, personal trauma that they experienced personally. And we see that shaping officers' enforcement and perspective from the data we collected. So again, looking at these quotes, so this officer describes here, like he lost his dad at a very young age to an overdose incident. And then we see here in this quote, just as a a side tangent, like many of the officers described, like as like repeated incidents of overdose. And so we see here some influence describing like why he doesn't arrest with the repeated incidents, but his officer described we can't charge him. He describes more often than not describing just getting this person help instead of charging them for this particular incident. And we move on to the final sub-theme, enforcement-oriented motivation. We see here enforcement-oriented motivation typically seen with many of the officers who had a military background have a more staunch view on harm reduction, less of more enforcement approach and less harm reduction. And we see just this officer describing his personal background and being in the military, along with his personal background of having family as also with the military background. And we see here this officer describes just naloxone and the access to naloxone and Narcan as enabling people to use drugs. And also we see like the different centers across Ohio popping up to help people with substance use disorder, as also enabling people to use drugs. So analyze this as like having a more staunch view on harm reduction with people who use drugs. And so just to synthesize everything, so we see officers' personal background as a motivator and influence with how they interact with people who use drugs and things like that. And we also see officers with public service-oriented motivations were more likely to be supportive of harm reduction practices, while officers with a more enforcement-oriented approach to policing having a more rigid view on harm reduction and towards people who use. And so the limitations of the study, we had a very small pool of people and it focused on 2 urban areas. We don't have looking at a non-urban policing as a perspective. The sample size also included majority non-Hispanic white males. So we have their perspective, but we don't have the perspective of a wide variety of others, even within the same police departments. And we emphasized looking at patrol level officers and not policy-oriented police officers, the higher ranking police officers. And we don't have the perspectives of people who use drugs for this particular study. But this study provides the qualitative insight into officers' shift towards a public health oriented approach to policing and the overdose epidemic. And so this is here with this QR code. You can check my references.
Questions?
Thank you very much for your research and presentation. Very interesting findings. I was especially interested in the second category, the personal family background category, because the first category and the third category were very theoretically distinct to me. But the second one, I would love for you to talk more about that, because if it's just about personal family background, then it doesn't necessarily say whether it's leads more toward the public service oriented side or the enforcement side, for instance.
So we've seen with that, with that, the familial background and trauma with substance use, which will thesis that we've seen it can be either or with their perspective on policing, because we've seen that with the personal background with familial trauma with substance use, also seen in police with military backgrounds, and they have a very distinct and rigid view. And we also see the opposite end with officers who are having a more open view on harm reduction and the way of policing, especially with overdoses and things like that.
So to Long's point there, I think the theme 1, PSM, and then also the familial type. The link there, I guess it's interesting that, right, if someone has that prior familial, I would call it psychological harm, right, to some degree, of an overdose in their family, and then they're willing, right, to go into a public service field, that they're going to be exerted through those same harms day in and day out. It's really interesting, right? And to know more of, is it that prior experience that's motivating them, right, to go in and then try to do something, right? So I think there is some kind of link there, and there's a lot of, probably a coping literature. So you can, Edry and Cohen, right, just published a paper on that of like trying to see, is it like kind of therapeutic in some degree, right? I lost my parent and like I want to get back, and maybe this is how I can get back, right? And some of the qualitative language you kind of point to, I think, in that regard, it's cool to help people, right? And especially if they've suffered personally from this.
We're going to pile on to this table. I also thought the second theme was really interesting, but thinking about maybe a slightly different mechanism. So personal trauma, I could see people have vastly different reactions to that depending on who the person was and what their relationship was, and then what happened with that relationship after the person overdosed, because it could be fatal, it could have not been fatal, it could have made them closer and valued life, or it could have been these people are just messed up, and that would feed into the more rigid perspective. And so I was thinking about this as we're also reading about the origin of stereotypes as prototypes, and if these early experiences with trauma left a kind of an imprint that led to either these prototypes of people who use drugs as either they need help or they should be punished. So I think that I don't know how much detailed information you got about those early experiences, but I think it's really interesting.
I want to celebrate this work. I really found the illustrative quotes helpful to understand all that I'm learning from you. One of the things I'd love to learn more about is this Good Samaritan law. Could you just tell me a little bit more about how old is that policy change when you interviewed these people? And was that something they voted on? I just would love to learn a little bit more about that.
Yes. So the Good Samaritan law, just put it in simple terms, is, and I'll just use an anecdote here. Sure. If someone is in the midst of an overdose and you assist them, you are immune to any actions towards you for providing them assistance, and this is applied to civilians, but also police officers, especially with the uptick in overdoses. And so the revision to the Ohio Revised Code added drug-related incidents to the Good Samaritan law. So it's a law within the bill, and that was in 2016. These participants are post-COVID, so around 2021, 2022 was when these interviews were conducted.
It's really helpful. Thank you.
All right, and our last question, Cordelia.
Yeah, so I guess when were these interviews, when did you do the interviews? And I was just wondering if you think there's been any shift over time towards maybe a more public health focused? So
I coded the interviews. I didn't conduct the interviews. They were conducted by Dr. Purdue, who's sitting behind you, and another researcher from our sister university. And I just don't want to speak into the data that I don't have, because we haven't conducted interviews post when these were conducted. But if we decide to add an extension and look at those responses, that would be interesting to see those responses towards being a more public health oriented in terms of this context.
Thank you very much. Cordelia. And then we will have a few minutes at the end. If you have been thinking about questions for our previous speakers and you didn't get to ask them, we'll have more time at the end.
Yeah, that's good. Sorry. Who has a say in enforcing environmental protection? That's the question I'm trying to answer with my thesis, Who Sues and Why? Environmental Nonprofits and Litigation. My name is Cordelia Van der Veer. I'm a senior studying public policy analysis and political science. All right, so this is the last time we've signed environmental regulation in the United States. This is our good friend Jimmy Carter when he signed CERCLA in 1980. But since then, Congress hasn't passed any environmental regulation. So it's up to environmental nonprofits to enforce environmental regulations. But we don't know much about these environmental nonprofits or what interests they have or what resources they have. So that's what I'm trying to answer with my thesis. And one of these environmental nonprofits is the Sierra Club. All right, so today I'm going to be going into my motivations on why we should study environmental nonprofits, or ENGOs for short. I'll get into my research questions, some of the theory behind what motivates environmental nonprofits to litigate, and then how I created a new data source for this project using data obtained from the IRS and from LexisNexis, and then some of my findings, which little preview, larger wildlife or water resource-focused environmental nonprofits with greater financial resources are more likely to litigate. And then at the end, I'll kind of sum it up and share some future research avenues. All right, so why on earth do I want to study environmental nonprofits? They are really important actors. They're the second largest plaintiff group among all federal decisions on environmental at the district court level. They're overwhelmingly pro-regulatory actors, so they're primarily suing the federal government. And another motivating factor behind this study is past research has studied environmental nonprofits, but only focused on the plaintiffs themselves, which is about 1% of environmental nonprofits. So where my study takes that forward is by comparing them to a larger universe of organizations. So we can learn more about the 99% and what makes the 1% different. So my research questions for this project, the first one was about the mission statements of the organization. So what kind of interests and topics are these organizations working on? And then the second one was about financial capacity and organizational capacity and how that influences engagement. So the theory behind this all is that Olson has demonstrated that, kind of theoretically, that a group's interest in litigating is about their legal resources, their political resources, their access to decision makers, and then why these environmental nonprofits are litigating is because I kind of mentioned at the start, the government is under-providing environmental protection. So haven't passed any environmental regulations since Jimmy Carter. So what do? The courts become the domain in which environmental decisions are litigated. And then also, it's important to note that different organizations have different goals and roles within litigation, so they're not all trying to do the same things. So how did I do this data collection? It was difficult. I was able to build on some of the research from the Ray Environment and Society Lab, who's a former professor at OSU. So I had access to all those decisions, and then I kind of completed the data set with some additional data collection and was able to get a list of all the environmental nonprofits involved. And then to get additional data, when an organization files their taxes, they have to report their finances, their mission statements. So I was able to kind of merge those data sets together to have a full picture of kind of all the environmental nonprofits, and then with an indicator variable of if they engaged or did not engage. And so some of my first findings, which are descriptive in nature but still really interesting, there's a few set organizations that are really dominant players in the courts. So this is your Sierra Club, Center for Biological Diversity, Wild Earth Guardians, and they're involved in a ton of different decisions. So it's really interesting because obviously their interests are really dominating, and yeah. So, and then moving on to my analysis, I wanted to analyze the mission statements of the organizations using a Texas data natural language approach. And funny enough, also used a BERT-based model, so it must be a great model. And I can go into the details on that in the Q&A if you're interested. But just for the purpose of this, once I gave all the mission statements to the model, it generated 34 topics. And then using my domain knowledge, I was able to kind of group them together into larger categories. So some of those included wildlife, water resources, animal welfare. And to give you an example, here's an example of a mission statement that the model identified as being wildlife focused. So welcome to read it, but this is the Center for Biological Diversity, which was one of the top plaintiffs in the data set. And you can kind of see, they do touch on some other focuses too, but their primary driving goal is wildlife, and the model was able to identify it based on patterns in the language they use in their mission statement. All right, so then the model I used, we don't have to get too into the weeds on this, but just to show you, I'm trying to predict litigation engagement at 0, 1, and then it's at the organizational level. And then some of my predictors are the revenues of the organization, and then if they report payroll taxes, which is kind of an indicator for size, so how many employees they have and if they're paying taxes on that. And then also the mission focus that I was able to compute based on my BERT-based model. And then I did a logistic regression, and I also accounted for regional differences. So my findings, again, don't want to get too into the math, but basically the idea is that if you're on this side of one, you're more likely, and you have this variable, you're more likely to engage than if you're on this side. So animal welfare is less likely versus wildlife and water resources are more likely. And then revenue also has an impact. So a doubling of revenue is associated with about a 29% higher odds of engagement, which is really interesting. So obviously kind of makes sense. Wealthier organizations that have more revenue are more likely to be in the courts, but that has a huge influence in what issues are actually being litigated on. And then also in terms of mission focus, as I said, water resources and wildlife focus groups are more likely to engage. Animal welfare organizations are less likely to engage. Also makes sense, humane society, maybe they don't need to get involved in litigation. And yeah, I guess some of the other findings were just that only 1% of organizations actually litigate. So again, really important for future research to consider kind of not just selecting on the dependent variable of engagement. I will say there's a lot of data issues, and so there's limits of like missing data and variables, but hopefully future research can address this. And yeah, so would love to expand to more recent years, more years. Would love to look at sources of revenues, like how nonprofits get their funding and if that impacts their engagement. Another thing that was really interesting was some organizations that were listed as plaintiffs didn't file their taxes or like didn't have an EIN. So it's kind of interesting, don't really know what's going on there and how these informal organizations have the capacity to litigate. And then another thing that I think could explain some of my results is like the relationships between organizations and how they form coalitions with each other. So I think also doing a network analysis approach could be super interesting. So yeah, these citizen supervisions and these environmental regulations, which is how the organizations get involved, create inequalities in how these organizations have access, and it's based on their resources, their focuses of the organizations, and this has huge implications for environmental enforcement and protection in the United States, especially as this is the primary domain where environmental policy decisions are being made. So thank you so much. Happy
Why a regional fixed effect?
Why regional fixed effects? Well, there are some regions where there's like way more litigation. So like in the DC District Court, for example, and there's a lot of organizations that are based in DC. So I wanted to account for some of those regional differences.
So you coded the NGOs as being tied to a particular region?
Yeah, so based on their IRS what they listed as their location. And then I kind of had like a regional category for each. I was gonna do state fixed effects initially, but then there weren't as many organizations like filing for each state. So I was able to group it by region.
But do you use at all at what level the litigation is happening?
I don't. So the unit of analysis is at the organizational level. So it's basically just like whose interests are being represented in the court, if that makes sense. So it's disconnected from the actual decision. It's
Often
just
if the case was started at a certain region, other NGOs may come on later on in an appellate stage, for example.
yeah, or organization from DC, like the Sierra Club, can say, oh, there's been dumping in the Olentangy River, we're gonna litigate about it. But I think it's interesting because like, I don't know if the Sierra Club is really representing the interests of the people in Columbus, and I do think that matters.
This is really interesting. I learned a lot from you. So if I understand correctly, you're focused on cases in 2016. What year are you focusing?
2016, yes.
2016. Do you have an interest in examining sort of like what they're litigating? Like there's been a lot of executive orders regarding environmental protections, and are you starting to see that come up in this case data?
Yeah, so my work wasn't actually focused on the decision text at all, actually, so it was kind of removed from that. I had to build a new data set of just like who's involved. But if you're interested, there's a really good paper, 2024, Ray and et al., the student researchers at Glenn kind of coded each of the decisions, and that research is more focused on the actual decision text and what the outcomes are and what regulations are invoked and whatnot. So this is kind of like supplementary to that because we didn't have any idea of really what the organizations were that were involved in that and driving that because, you know, it's important to, I think, study what's actually happening, but to kind of understand like how these organizations even get to the court in the first place. And like, it's hard to say, right? But this kind of, I think, paints a little bit of a picture about that.
Can I ask another one? This is so interesting. You mentioned the importance of revenue. So do you have any indication, and I don't know these tax statements, but like where is the source of that revenue? Like are they getting damages in the lawsuits? And so is it like self-reinforcing? Like you sue, you get damages, and then you use that revenue to sue again?
Yeah, I mean, that could be part of it. And I think that's like one of the things I would love to like explore more in my future research and look really how they get the revenue sources. Because there's been some interesting literature about how organizations, for example, that receive federal grants are more likely to engage in advocacy. So I do think the revenue sources matter and something I want to continue exploring. And yeah, in terms of the I'm using 2016 data, so it should be before the litigation to try to reconcile that.
Smart. Yeah.
So wildlife and water. And I'm thinking, is the government just like particularly negligent in enforcing that? Or is it just that we have laws around wildlife and water? Like I'm trying to, like what's your theory as to why those show up?
Yeah, I think a lot of it also has to do with, like I said, like the coalitions that form. Okay. So for example, it's not necessarily at the decision level. So, for example, I think probably what it is that there's a lot of wildlife organizations that work together, and then there'll be like 20 organizations listed as plaintiffs, and so those are like kind of the dominant players, even if like there aren't necessarily a higher volume of decisions, but it's also about obviously the legislation and how they get access to exploiting the citizen suit provisions of this regulations as well. So
this is just
layers.
an aside, but as someone who's spent years in a national nonprofit focused on conservation, at least from my perspective, those were the kinds of organizations also that politically were the most mixed across the conservative liberal spectrum, across R&D, were around wildlife and water. And I don't know if there's anything there, but...
Yeah, you know, it's really interesting because like part of the reason why I got really interested in this was because I was working on a project about like judicial ideology and how like the judge's like ideology impacts how they rule on environmental decisions. And so it's like kind of interesting how the ideology of the judge, but then also like the ideology of the organization could impact the outcome. So, because obviously, I was going to actually have a picture of Nixon on there. Like a lot of the regulations that were signed, a lot of these like major environmental regulations that were signed in the 60s and 70s were signed by Republicans. It wasn't as much of a partisan issue back then.
All right, well, let's give Cordelia a round of applause. And then if we could just open it up, if people have last question or some questions for any of our speakers, please raise your hand.
So I don't have a question, but I have a comment.
Yeah.
So when I was an undergrad student, I had no idea what fixed specs was. I don't even know whether I had any idea when I was doing my bachelor's. So very impressive, yeah. So I was just thinking about where I was when I was an undergrad student. So, yeah.
I just had a good job, Cordelia. I haven't seen you in a while. The fact that 3 of the presentations use kind of models for natural language processing, I think tells me something about maybe the mismatch between some of the methods we're teaching in our classes and what's needed by fields that are on the edge sometimes. And I have found as an advisor that some of the methodology we have used historically in our own work is poorly designed for the current data questions that students are asking. So I feel like it's not a question but a comment that I'm glad you used something new, I'm glad you learned something new, but thought.
Oh yeah, it says you talked about coalitions of large and small ENGOs. Is there any benefit or trend for the large organization to partner with a small organization?
Okay, getting back into my presenting mode. I think, I think they can offer expertise in a particular niche topic or offer like some sort of other like coalition asset of like, maybe they have a lot of members or something like that, or also they're very aware of the community. I think that was where a lot of the smaller organizations came into place that was actually being impacted by the environmental dispute happening.
Any other questions in the chat?
No, that was it.
I have a question for all the speakers. Could you maybe just like in a one sentence or so reflect on like what you learned that was most impactful as part of your research? So it could be about the project, or maybe it's about yourself or your future. What was the sort of like one sentence most impactful thing you learned?
I would say like let the data speak for itself. Because whatever topic you're researching, you can have your personal opinions preemptively before researching is what. Let the data set guide the outcome, even with your maybe personal biases in the back of your mind, and look like how the outcome you want, or the outcome you want.
I was going to say, I think a lot of the times whenever we're coming up with a topic, or at least it's hard for me to come up with a specific topic, I kind of had to start with like a broad field AI and then go into like what I knew and what I saw. I think I was surprised by the amount of studies there were out there about predictive models and even machine learning models. It was just a matter of, and part of my framework was having to put the sources together and then identify what the domains were. I guess I was surprised to see that there actually were studies out there. It was just a matter of like identifying what parts were applicable to this specific
I definitely learned about the methodology. Like before going into research, I knew nothing about like natural language processing models or how machine learning models work. So it was definitely interesting to learn much about that part and how to use that in research.
found it interesting that, or I kind of learned that things are, I don't know, from the natural language processing perspective, things are actually quite connected. ChatGPT is a type of natural language processing model, and it's interesting to see like how things that we do or some other things that maybe people at Anthropic are doing too.
I would say for me, it's obviously like natural language processing and like using fancy statistics is really cool, but I think sometimes like the most powerful findings can just be from like descriptive data.
Well, I think that was a great last question, and I just want to emphasize again just how proud we are that you all took on this research that you're doing. This is not an insignificant endeavor, and look forward to further celebrating those of you who are graduating with research distinction. Gosh, is that next week? Oh gosh. So a final round of applause for our